Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief you on the unfolding events in and around Gaza. I'm afraid that the last 2 days have seen the most serious escalation since the 2014 conflict between Hamas and Israel, and they have been a warning to all of us how close we are to the brink of war every day. Between the 28th and the 30th of May, according to the Israeli Defense Forces, 216 projectiles, rockets, and mortar shells were fired from Gaza towards Israel, some 77 of which hit areas in the Eshkol, Sha'ar HaNegev, and Sdot Negev regions. Although most of the projectiles were intercepted by the Iron Dome system, one hit a kindergarten yard in a kibbutz near the Gaza border, and at least one other damaged a house. Thankfully, there have been no casualties or serious injuries. In response to these attacks and mortars, the Israeli Air Force carried out strikes on 65 Hamas and Islamic Jihad targets in Gaza and destroyed a 2-kilometer tunnel near the Kerem Shalom crossing. No casualties or serious injuries have been reported in Gaza as a result of the strikes. On May 29th, Hamas's Qassam brigades and the Islamic Jihad Saraya al-Quds claimed joint responsibility for the rockets and mortars fired at Israel. Their joint statement blamed Israel for targeting their fighters and military positions during the preceding 48 hours, cautioned against attempts to dictate new equations on the status quo, and warned that they would reciprocate, quote, shelling with shelling and blood with blood, end quote. Prime Minister Netanyahu, meanwhile, vowed that Israel would respond with great force to the rocket attacks as for more than 24 hours, Israeli communities around Gaza lived with the fear of having mere seconds to seek shelter from incoming rockets. Madam President, such attacks are completely unacceptable. The firing of rockets and mortars against civilians cannot be justified under any circumstances. I take this opportunity to call on the international community to join me in unequivocally condemning the indiscriminate targeting of civilians and the dangerous escalation in Gaza. This dangerous escalation comes after a series of warnings by the United Nations and in the context of recent developments on the ground. It cannot be divorced from the context of the 2 months of protests at the Gaza fence, in which some 110 Palestinians were killed and a large number were injured. Throughout this period, militants have also placed improvised explosive devices at the perimeter fence and attempted, sometimes successfully, to breach it with the intent of damaging military infrastructure and perpetuating attacks against Israelis. Particularly in the days following May 14th, several such incidents were filmed and posted on social media, prompting a response by Israel on targets inside Gaza. On May 27th, in response to an IED found by the Israeli Defense Forces adjacent to the fence, the IDF targeted a Palestinian Islamic Jihad observation post and killed 3 members of the group. Islamic Jihad issued a statement vowing to retaliate for what they described as a dangerous escalation. Subsequently, on May 28th, the IDF announced it had fired a tank shell at another observation post, killing a member of Hamas's military wing. The shelling took place after Israeli troops came under fire, reportedly by Hamas militants, while arresting 2 Palestinians who had crossed the perimeter fence into Israel. During the night of May the 28th, machine gun fire from Gaza also hit the Israeli city of Sderot, causing damage to several buildings and a vehicle. The next day, the situation escalated. Madam President, since the early hours of this morning, the situation has quieted down, and since 5 a.m., there have been no projectiles launched from Gaza, nor any IDF strikes on locations inside the Strip. In this respect, I welcome the efforts of Egypt to ensure that calm prevails and reiterate my call on all sides to uphold all understandings and prevent the recurrence of any incident that jeopardizes the lives of Israelis and Palestinians alike. It is imperative that this period of calm be preserved at all costs. No one in Gaza can afford another war. No one has the right to play with the lives of 2 million people who have lived through hell in the last decade. No one should live in fear of an indiscriminate rocket attack. Everyone has a responsibility to do their part to de-escalate and to step back from the brink in the interests of their own people and the future of their own children. As demonstrations and protests in Gaza continue into the month of May, I'm concerned that we may experience further violence and further risks of escalation. Madam President, despite the dangerous escalation, Gaza's civilian infrastructure did not sustain any significant damage as a result of Israeli retaliatory fire yesterday. Moreover, the crossing points for people and goods remained open and functioned normally. The Rafah crossing into Egypt continued operations for the 19th consecutive day, and both Kerem Shalom and Eretz crossings into Israel functioned with only minor delays. Nevertheless, fire from Gaza has caused damage to electricity installations on the Israeli side, resulting in a reduction of over 30% of the only electricity supply to Gaza, and it will take a few days at least to repair them. As I recently briefed the Council, Gaza's electricity, water and health systems continue to experience unprecedented strain. Egyptian electricity lines have been effectively down since February, and the Gaza power plant has not functioned since April. Today, the total supply for Gaza is barely enough to provide 3 hours of sustained electricity. Madam President, finally, during my briefing to the Council last week, I was greatly encouraged by the willingness of Council members to consider ideas to change the reality in Gaza. Under the current circumstances, failure to act immediately with a set of relatively modest, achievable interventions will only amplify the humanitarian crisis, but drastically increase the risk of confrontation. The goals that I outlined last week remain as valid as ever: to prevent a war with potential regional implications, to address the urgent humanitarian needs of the population, and to support Egyptian reconciliation efforts. This means that we need to urgently implement already approved projects, revive efforts to empower the government to take up its responsibilities, and very importantly, sustain the 2014 ceasefire understandings on the ground and halt the militant buildup. The United Nations will move forward on immediately enhancing our capacity and presence to facilitate project implementation in Gaza and improve coordination with Israel, Egypt and the Palestinian Authority to overcome political, administrative and logistical blockages. It is important that all sides agree to improve movement and access restrictions and ensure uninterrupted and upgraded water and electricity supply to the population. This plan is the only sustainable way to ensure that we do not slide again into another devastating conflict, that we do not allow Gaza to become a pawn in somebody else's plans, another tragedy on the already crowded map of regional Middle East conflicts. But let me also use this opportunity to send a very clear message to Palestinians in Gaza. We hear your plight, we see your suffering, and we will do all that we can to ensure that you have a future beyond mere survival, a future of freedom and development, a future focused on peace and prosperity, where you are the masters of your own fate, a future for all Palestinians under a single democratic government living in a state of Palestine, side by side in peace and security with the State of Israel. That is why we need to make sure that calm persists, that the militant buildup ends, and that we deny those who want to disrupt peace any opportunity to do so. Without these conditions, it will be impossible to move forward on achieving our long-term political and developmental goals. It is high time that we intensify our calls on Israelis and Palestinians to undertake concrete steps that will advance the goal of a just and sustainable peace. Such actions must encompass the overarching political objectives: the unification of Gaza and the West Bank under a single democratic and legitimate Palestinian Authority, an end to the occupation, and a resolution to the wider Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of the two-state solution and in line with previous agreements and relevant UN resolutions. This latest round of attacks is a warning. It is a warning to all of us how close to the brink of war we are every single day. Thank you very much.